The exciting thing for me is that more and more people are realizing the same thing, that like media is broken. So the problem's only gotten bigger, and we have the solution.
I would agree. I think it's a huge remaining unsolved problem is this connection between distribution and creation. If you think of way back 15, 20 years ago, more, when people were starting to realize you could distribute content on the internet and they were going, oh my God, this is going to completely drive all the studios out of business. Everyone's just going to create content. And the answer is yes, everyone creates content, but 99.999% of it sucks and nobody wants it.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Coinage. I'm your host, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios here in New York City, and excited to have on Coinage today the co-founder and first CEO at a little company that started out sending DVDs in the mail. And I realize, actually, today that there may be some viewers out there that have never touched DVDs and maybe even never sent anything in the mail. That company, I should say, that I'm talking about is Netflix, and it's my pleasure to welcome back on Coinage Netflix co-founder and author of That Will Never Work, Marc Randolph. Marc, it's good to see you, man.
Great to see you too, Zach. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's been a minute, and obviously, for starters, for those who don't know, obviously love chatting with you, and I first met you when I was back at Yahoo Finance, and since you've gone on to write what I've said to multiple people is my favorite business book, because it's an honest, I think, as I've done this longer, Marc, an honest representation of a founder life and what goes into this. Had I known that everything in there was true, I might not have done this, to be honest with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wrote it for you, Zach. It's like people who go, "Oh God, this startup thing sounds fun." Well,
Yeah.
I hoped I could kind of, but as I hope it came through in the book, besides a lot of the painful, difficult, scary parts, there are some tremendously gratifying aspects of being an entrepreneur, and hopefully, you're starting to figure that part out too.
Yes. I mean, I think right now it's an interesting time to have you back on because it's been 2 years since we had you on Coinage to talk about kind of what we're building. Of course, I'll always continue to thank you for not just writing the book, but for being one of our first mentors when we got off the ground to kind of revolutionize media and this idea of what Web3 can do for media. And we're kind of interestingly hitting an inflection point right now because with the rise of Zora and Base and all kinds of different things right now, the on-chain creator economy is hot. And I think back about all the work that we put in to get to this moment, it's very similar to what I was rereading in That Will Never Work, kind of the experimentation phase that you talk about. And so just expectation setting for what we want to get into is not just the lessons in the book and getting Netflix to where it is, but also kind of skating to where the puck's going to be in tech and how you've thought through kind of using that again and again since the days of Netflix, kind of advice for people on where to see where the world's going to go. And then to wrap up, I'd love to get your take on kind of how you think, if you've experimented with AI, kind of how you think AI is going to change all of these different things. Because for us at content, or in the world of content, I think it's very interesting to think about ownership in media, and even more so, I think, become committed to what we're doing here. But for those who don't know the story, Marc, maybe we just start there in terms of, I guess, founding Netflix is one thing, but writing the book about the founding of Netflix is another thing. And I guess since you've even reflected on writing that book and where we are now in the world of content, how different of a world are we in today than if you could think back to 97 and the world you were in then?
Well, certainly, obviously, in some ways, it's tremendously different. But in some ways, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Uh, for one thing, we started Netflix a long time ago. This was back in 1997. So, gosh, it's coming up in almost 30 years ago. And the world certainly, at least technically, was a very different place back then. When we were trying to figure out whether this ridiculous idea we had of could we rent DVDs by mail by using a website, the idea of being able to use a website for anything was no simple matter. I mean, you could not, like you can now, go on and just set up a Shopify store. You cannot use AWS to handle all the complexity of your volume and your routing. And, if you wanted to take payments, you didn't have PayPal or Stripe. We had to write every single thing from scratch. So in some ways, we used to say that, the distance from, inspiration to validation or from ideation to validation was for us 6 months long and cost us $1 million. And of course, what's happened now is all those things are in place. It's tremendous technical tools available to take these ideas you have and quickly and easily make them happen. We'll talk more about AI later. But AI is shortening those timelines and those cost horizons even shorter. Um, so, in one way, very, very, very different world. We were betting on completely nascent technology. But of course, the thing that stayed the same is has in some ways gotten worse, which is back then you had to bet on some unproven technology. I mean, in our case, we were betting on DVD, which was this completely novel way of distributing content. On for those of you who are younger, little plastic disc called a movie. There used to be things called videos
Yeah.
that were actually a physical thing
It's
rather than a
crazy though
digital
because
thing.
it's like even Blockbuster, it's like you can't even use it as like the descriptor because like a lot of people just weren't around for Blockbuster. It's crazy.
I know. I got to come up with some newer analogies here. But the point is that when we bet on this thing DVD, there were hardly any around, and our whole premise was this thing might actually become a ubiquitous mechanism, so every household has one, and off we go. But that was by no means certain, and that was required because you could not jump into a fully saturated space and hope to be able to make a startup work, because a startup, almost by definition, is so rough and broken that if you don't have this greenfield opportunity, you're in trouble. But you're betting that this DVD thing might actually be a greenfield and not go the way of something like Laserdisc, which, if you don't know what Laserdisc is, that's exactly the point. It could have gone the other way.
Yeah.
And the same things happen now. I mean, very early on, we had this explosion of interest in blockchain and NFTs and all these kind of new interesting technologies for content, for creating, for businesses. And a lot of people, yourself included, bet on it at a time you just weren't sure what direction it was going to go. And so not only are you placing this bet, will this thing actually be something that becomes useful in the future, but you're even less certain on what form it's going to take in the future. And so those stories and those lessons, I think, are evergreen.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, obviously, I was looking back on when we chatted 2 years ago, and you were spot on even then in terms of the idea of advice to any entrepreneur, no matter what field they're in. It's kind of like, look, you start something, you don't know where those developments are going to go, you don't know what they're going to unlock. And at the time, we were talking a lot about NFTs. In the NFT boom, and obviously we haven't changed that. There's certain things that I think is really tricky to get right, and I'd love to get your take on this too. Is kind of the advice to entrepreneurs in terms of, yes, you can tweak and experiment, but don't throw everything out at once. For us, we stuck with the membership model using NFTs because to me, that's still, there are different things that coins, tokens, and NFTs can unlock in terms of memberships and co-owning things together. And so there's a part in your book too where you talk about this in terms of ideas. And if people haven't read the book, I think the thing that I love is how many ideas you went through before you landed on Netflix. And one of the things that you write in the book is, the best ideas don't come in a flash; they come from testing, and that it's not always kind of lightning hitting you. And so I'm kind of curious in terms of how you give founders advice to say, "Hey, look, experiment, but don't throw out everything at once if it's not working, because who knows."
Yeah, probably the other big difference between when I started and now is that back then there wasn't this huge glorification of entrepreneurship. Um, back then we were just all kind of figuring shit out. And now, of course, everybody expects the epiphany that they think you're going to have this one singular idea and it's going to come to you in a bolt of lightning and it's going to spring forth fully formed as this perfect idea. And all you have to do is build it. And one of the things I've certainly learned after 40 years in this business is that that's never happens that way. Yeah, you may have a quick bolt of lightning, but your job is to go not to bet everything on that because I guarantee it's wrong. It's flawed. There's something that doesn't work about it. In fact, most of the things you believe are going to happen are wrong and are not going to happen. So you're right. The idea is to start, but don't start with, I have to build this fully formed, massive, perfect, complex thing. The real skill of an entrepreneur is how clever and creative can you be to figure out a way to validate your idea really quickly, really cheaply and easily, so you can start that process of learning why your idea is flawed
Mm-hmm.
or that your idea maybe has one little glimmer of things in it that you want to then pursue. It is this process of constantly trying different things, testing things, trying variations, and you can only do that if each of these little tests, each of these little tweaks is small, inconsequential, cheap, and fast. That I firmly believe, that success is directly correlated to how many different things you can try.
Hmm.
And then, of course, the number of things you try is directly correlated to how quickly, cheaply, and easily you try them. The biggest mistake, and I'm going to, quote another a friend of mine who's a, pretty reasonably successful founder as well, a guy named Uri Levine, founded Waze and a whole bunch of other stuff. But he often says, don't fall in love with the idea, fall in love with the problem. Be willing to abandon your idea at the very first inkling that it's not working. But the problem, the thing
Hmm.
you're trying to solve, that's what carries you forward. That's the thing that gets deeper and richer and more nuanced. I mean, and so it certainly applies to you, Zach. You're hopefully going, there's a really interesting nut here of how do I do content in a whole different way? How do I distribute ownership and input and all the things you're trying to fix?
Yeah.
But I hope you're not locking into a single way this has to happen and saying, God damn it, I'm going to prove it. And I'm going to keep banging my head against the door because that's what entrepreneurs do. No,
Yeah.
you've got to be willing to keep trying lots of different things because you never know where the keyhole is. It's actually going to be the one that opens the door.
Well, that's actually a very interesting segue into kind of, and part of this, as we agreed to, part of this might just be, a very open and honest founder therapy because, you've always been super helpful to me in terms of, hey, Mark, this is working the same. What are we thinking here? And it is a very interesting corollary because, as I mentioned, in terms of NFT memberships, look, it's been working. In terms of the NFT, since we had you on, it was zero point zero 0.07 ETH is what we launched. Now, 0.25 ETH. So that's a 3xer in NFT land where most are dead. So I'm not going to say anything bad about it because it's working. But I also couldn't help but notice that, yes, there were certain things that people were doing in token land. And so we didn't pivot necessarily, but we do have a new partnership on the Zora side of things. In Texas, I don't know if you want to bring this up, but Mark, I haven't told you about this necessarily, but things are cranking on this as we're one of the top Zora creator coins. And so there are certain things that are different between NFT membership and what we're trying to do there on the ownership side and tokens. And I get why people love them. And so at some point I was like, you know what? Maybe the market's telling me something here. Maybe we do need to have more of a fungible token to go with our non-fungible token. And so we did, and it's worked out well. But part of that is what you just said. It comes back to the problem. It comes back to why is media broken? What are the issues that need solving? And this is where I think, this is why I love chatting with you because you've already revolutionized media once before. And I didn't know it until we saw you mint that you actually had looked into Web3 and kind of thought about things from that lens because I do think increasingly, and maybe this is where we look ahead, is ownership around stuff matters so much. Like certainly distribution matters. And that's partially why we leaned into this creator coin is because it lets us kind of have a wider net top of funnel to get Coinage and the brand out there. But like to me as a first time founder, I keep going back to this. This is something that like everyone always says is like founders are obsessive about the product, but they forget about distribution. And like to me, that's really kind of where Netflix still today is kind of the distribution powerhouse of content. And so I'm curious to get your take around that in terms of like what is the lesson around distribution and getting something out there, a solution to a problem? Because the exciting thing for me is that more and more people are realizing the same thing that like media is broken. So the problem's only gotten bigger and we have the solution.
I would agree. I think it's a huge remaining unsolved problem is this connection between distribution and creation. And if you think of way back, way back, what, 15, 20 years ago or more, when people were starting to realize you could distribute content on the internet, and they were going, oh my God, this is going to completely drive all the studios out of business. Now, everyone's just going to create content. And the answer is yes, everyone creates content, but 99.999% of it sucks and nobody wants it. And and so you still have not joined these two worlds. And perhaps the most successful thing I've seen, which is encouraging, is someone like a Mr.Beast,
Mm-hmm.
which now has viewership, which exceeds in most ways many of the large studios. and he started as saying, I'm just a creator who's putting out shit that I think is funny and
Yeah.
interesting and other people will want to watch, and focuses on it. But jumping back to like a Netflix thing, yes, what Netflix has done has moved it in a reasonably large direction away from this monolithic creator model where the studio goes, we have to pick things to do which very, very large numbers of people are going to want to watch, which is why you end up with Spider-Man 93, and Fast and Furious 64.2. It becomes
Vin Diesel's gonna
formulaic.
be in a wheelchair at some point. He's gonna be like literally in a wheelchair, and he's fast
He'll
now.
be an
He's very
AI.
fast.
He'll be an AI creation. I'll be an
Yes.
avatar, and you won't be able to tell the difference. But the thing is that what Netflix has done in some ways, which I think is very impressive, is they've begun to move it and they begin to recognize we don't need to generate hits all the time. What we really just need to do is say, is this this segment large enough to validate the investment it took to create the content for them? Which does not mean that it has to be a $200 million box office if you didn't spend $150 million on it. And it doesn't mean it has to be all created in Hollywood. It can be created all over the world by local artists, local producers, local directors, local
Hmm.
writers. But it still has not bridged its way all the way over toward not the right analogy for it, but the YouTube community.
Yeah.
You haven't matched those two pieces yet, and I think that's still one of the big remaining prizes of media is how do you get that level of distribution, but put that level of distribution in the hands of individual creators who extending that model that Netflix has of saying, yeah, we have an office in Sao Paulo, which dedicates its focus on Brazilian content.
Hmm.
But there are people, just like the internet showed us 25 years ago, with extremely narrow, value content niches, and that
Yes.
hasn't been connected very well yet.
Well, our producer, who's from Brazil, is also cheering at a Sao Paulo reference right there, and has edited films for Netflix too. So shout out to Texas, who's here standing by. But also, I suppose on that point, that is also where my thesis was stemming from too. Was okay. Obviously, I come from a news background, and that's where we met on Yahoo Finance. And going to that slide over here, Texas, it's like the problem with media is still there. It's a problem in terms of trust. If you only monetize selling ads, then you're going to see what we're seeing, which is people don't really trust mainstream media. It's at an all-time low. And certainly news is very different than like Squid Games or Fast and the Furious as we're talking about it. But it is interesting to see you mentioned Mr. Beast and the idea of YouTubers or celebrities who are kind of now falling under the same trap is like, hey, I've got a bunch of distribution now because I've got a huge Instagram following or YouTube following, but I'm going to monetize it the same way. I'm going to sell ads or figure out a way to sell products to my followers and kind of people get the sense of kind of selling out there too. And so that's kind of where the idea of, all right, how do we create this new iteration of the creator economy, this new idea of can you monetize things differently? And I'd be curious to get your take on this too, if you'd agree, is that like, I don't think anyone's going to dethrone the YouTubes, probably not even the Netflixes of the world, because like that's where people go to consume content. But I do think in terms of what you mentioned in a smaller scale, bringing together a creator like a Mr. Beast and their audience to let them co-own the IP of what they're making and what they want to see made does allow suddenly something like not Fast and the Furious 97, but something that like wouldn't have gotten made in Hollywood made because like enough people seeded the idea to see it come to fruition, and then they own it together.
Yeah, listen, I bought your coin, your tokens a long time ago based on that premise. I'm still a big believer. It is the power of blockchain. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not just NFTs. It's that power of being able to. It's ownership, but it's distributed ownership. It's different models of ownership. It's such an interesting category. I think its applications to media are still out there, and I applaud the direction you're taking it. And I guess bringing this thing way back to being like therapy for founders,
Yeah.
really, it's that I don't think we know what the model is yet. And I think the danger is one of the things you have to do is be really careful. You do have to bet on some approaches
Hmm.
because otherwise they won't work well. They won't function properly. So you've got to invest properly to make it work for people. But at the same time, I don't think, and maybe this is debatable, we know yet what the right model is for
No, for
distributed
sure.
content ownership.
No, certainly not.
And it applies to back when we started Netflix. We knew that eventually it was going to be a digital medium, that it was going to be distributed, through the ether. Yeah, we weren't sure whether it was going to be downloaded or whether it was going to be streamed, but we knew that was coming. And similar to how the NFT world looked or the token world looked a couple of years ago, no one was sure exactly how that was going to take place, how it was
Hmm.
going to work. And so the question then, at least for us, was how do you bet on this future at a time when the future isn't here yet?
Yeah.
And we couldn't launch. We knew eventually there was going to be a digital world. Let's say it was streaming. It could have been streaming or downloading, but we couldn't have bet on it being a streaming world because at the time this was no content available for streaming. The studios weren't willing to put their bits in the clear for fear of being Napstered, and the technology wasn't there. There wasn't the digital rights management. There wasn't the bandwidth to the home. So even though we knew that that probably was the direction that Netflix was going to go, we just couldn't go there at the beginning because it wasn't possible. So then you begin thinking, what do you build in the meantime? What is the asset that you're going to own, which will work now, allow you to have a real business, allow you to be economically sustainable, but be setting you up and be building equity month over month and year over year so that eventually when the world does get to a place where a digital business is possible, that you're in the strongest possible position.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I think that's probably the smartest thing we did at Netflix is how we positioned the company so that when finally streaming became possible, which was 9 years after we started, we'd been building that base for those entire 9 years. And then finally, 10 years later, when all of a sudden the world goes, hey, this streaming thing seems like it's a better way to do content. Now we had almost, 18, 19 years of history at getting good at this when all of a sudden then Disney enters and et cetera,
Yeah. I mean,
on
that's
that.
the other interesting thing too, is that like how it's been able to be held up even after more people have come in and tried to replicate the streaming game, and like how the staying power of Netflix does stem back to the idea of a first mover in terms of you guys realizing what things were going to look like and how you build a company around it. B, execution. I think the other good thing that I took from your book too is just like everyone has an idea. It's like how hard do you want to work on them and actually get them done, and choose to put in the hard work. And I think that's also the interesting piece of like, okay, you're right. We don't know what's going to work. So in terms of like the way that we built Coinage as, leaning into co-ownership over something versus the idea of what does that model look like for people who aren't in crypto, might not know how this all works, might not care about ownership as much as just enjoying things. And so, we worked on a food show at Trustless Media, our production company that I founded too, in terms of copying that model too. And so this is a little bit of alpha on the stream as we're streaming live, because we also are now replicating or trying to replicate what we've done with Coinage on this platform Zora, with Best Dish Ever as well, and kicking that off. But I think it goes to your point, Mark, in terms of you never know what's going to work. So you need to experiment with these things. And then we'll find out if people actually care about co-ownership or not, if they're just interested in kind of like speculating on things, and that's totally fine. But I do
It,
think,
it's making it's making a strategic bet, but there is this thing that you're always holding on to that go, this is the gem that I'm trying to get to. How I get there, I'm extremely flexible about because I'm going to start down a path, bump into something, have to back up, go a different way. But there has to be some general sense of where you're going. I mean, and Netflix, like I said, that the holy grail was always that there was going to be this world where content was delivered digitally, and how do we set ourselves up for that? And how you do that was the smart thing. And you can't position yourself as being the best shipper of plastic. You can't position yourself as being the best digital streamer because you have to say, what is it? And for us, it was you got to be about content. You
mhm.
got to be about great stories. You got to be about discovery. And it's very possible to do that in the DVD world, and you can get better and better. It's got to be at novel ways of paying for it. I mean, this whole subscription model now, of course, every thing in the world is a subscription. Back then, it was record and tape clubs and magazines. And so it was a ridiculous idea to go, you can do video rental subscription? What the hell?
Yeah.
Um, and we invested in that, and those things all come. So all of a sudden, when it's possible, you have the ingredients in place, and I think that's going to be a very very similar thing for you. It's a similar thing for almost every entrepreneur. Is you're it's the analogy I've sometimes used is like I do a lot of mountain biking, and so you're whipping down this trail, and you've got to be watching about 4 or 5 feet in front of your handlebars because you're constantly adjusting and changing. But at the same time, you got to periodically look up.
Hmm.
But if you spend too much time looking up, you're going to go over the edge. If you don't spend enough time looking up, you're going to end up on some ridiculous wrong turn. You're not going to catch that big turn coming up ahead.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing. We have to be, for the most part, looking in front of our feet because
Yeah.
the execution of this stuff is so brutal.
Well, I mean,
But
so I want to learn. I
picking
want to
up
pivot
the
a little bit into that too, because I think that's a good point. And of course, obviously, again, I would be remiss if I didn't mention not financial advice. Obviously, we're showing kind of all this because it again is back to kind of the experimentation piece, and we'll see what happens in terms of getting Best Dishever off the ground, the same way that we've just seen Coinage get off the ground for this too. But I do think, in terms of mistakes, Mark, that's another thing that you're very candid about in the book, and certainly I would be candid if anyone were to ask me like how things have gone in crypto, because there have been so many things that haven't necessarily panned out in terms of what people had hoped would pan out with crypto. There have been crashes, collapses, it goes up, it goes down. But to your point, the payments piece is still kind of there in terms of making things easier, cheaper, experimentation. And I think that that's kind of maybe another thing to highlight for other people, builders who are kind of thinking about, how do I take the lessons I've learned in that mountain biking example and how do I apply them? I know you talk about this in the book, but for those who haven't read it, big mistakes that you'd say are kind of key learnings for you.
yeah, boy, I get asked that question so many times, Zach, and it's a really hard answer because this is going to sound so stupid and so trite, but I don't really see them as mistakes
Yes.
anymore. Um,
They're like experiments that
almost,
didn't go, they're like hypotheses. Is that fair to say that like didn't pan out the way that you thought they
yeah,
would?
that's a better way. There's two things about it. Number one is that listen, I've that risk taking, that doing something in it without knowing in advance how it's going to turn out, which is my definition of what risk taking really is. Um, Boy, as an entrepreneur, you're doing that 1,000 times a day. You're constantly doing things and trying things that you have no idea what the outcome is going to look like. So, of course, they're not going to work 99.7% of the time. And so the skill is not getting up the courage to try a hard thing. The skill is how do you make these risks very, very small so that you're trying things, but if they don't work, there's no real significant consequence to it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've now done that for so long, so many thousands of times that it doesn't. I don't even hesitate. It doesn't scare me. I'm not reticent to fail or look stupid because I realize if almost every single thing I try, I learn something from. I mean, at the single biggest extreme, I learned that thing didn't work. But that's rarely the only thing you learn. Not only do you learn that thing didn't work, but you get some glimmer of what the direction you need to go.
Mm-hmm.
But wait, there's a bigger piece about this whole failures and mistakes, which is that it's really hard to identify what's truly a failure. And I'll give you a perfect example. And this story is in the book, so available bookstores near you. Which is that at one point, this is not long after we launched the subscription business, and huge success, but hugely expensive. .com crash of 2000, which people read in the history books at some point. Most people haven't lived through that recently. But anyway, Netflix is in deep shit. We're about to go out of business, going broke, can't raise money, need to sell the company. Try to sell it to Blockbuster. Fly to Dallas, disastrous meeting. And rather than saving our ass, which we hoped they would do by buying the company, they announced they're going to be competing with us. Ugh. Okay, so let's talk about mistakes. So on the flight to Dallas for this meeting, this was my single biggest thing I had to do. We had been trying for months now to figure out some way to salvage the company. How do you raise money? How do you pivot it? We were out of ideas. So I go, okay, this is it. This is the Hail Mary. I have to be able to sell this company to Blockbuster to save the company, to save my investors' investments, to save everyone's jobs. This is what I got to do one thing. And I failed. They basically laughed at us. We went home with our tail between our legs. And as I was flying back from Dallas, I was going, I completely, this is it. I had one big thing to do and I failed.
Mm-hmm.
Biggest failure of my life. And looking back, was that really a failure?
Yeah.
Or was it, in fact, the best possible thing that could have happened to us? Partly because you can always play the game, what if? But boy, I'm sure if they had bought us, I certainly wouldn't be talking to you because no one would know what the hell Netflix is. And Blockbuster would have, I'm sure, completely screwed it up and all the people would have quit. But more importantly, by them not buying us, it gave us this renewed sense of discipline that, as my dad sometimes would say, Mark, the only way out sometimes is through.
Yeah.
You got to face it head on. And we laid people off and we cut our salaries and we focused lines of business. And we have got to get through this on our own. And we've got to, now this is a crazy concept. We got to figure out some business where we actually get paid more to do it than it cost us to do it.
Yeah, it seems like in the tech world, maybe that's not always the thing today necessarily, but certainly for a small stage startup like ours, that is what we're focusing on doing as well. And it does force issues in terms of like, okay, like you said, the only way out is through. And so I do wonder, that's one of the things too, from the book and kind of comforting now as, I go on year 4 of doing this is like getting told no over and over again, or that will never work over and over again is kind of like, you got to be ready for that and you got to be prepped for it because it's going to happen. But I am kind of curious in terms of how and I know you coach a lot of founders, but like the idea of taking that skepticism, because it's the same thing, like whether it's NFTs or DAOs or whatever we've tried to pioneer here at Coinage, it's like everyone's always like, that died years ago. And it's like NFTs came and went, that died. And it's like, well, hold on now. Not necessarily. Things are working. And so same thing with creator coins. Now they're launched. Everyone's like, oh, it's just another meme coin. It's like meme coins died. It's like, no, hold on now. They can work. And so like, how do you go through getting told no that many times? How do you fight the skepticism to say, no, it's just, we're early, we're not wrong?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because listen, and the reason I called the book "That Will Never Work" is because, as you're surmising, that's what every single person told me that I pitched that idea to, whether investors or employees. When I told my wife that idea, she thought it was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard. And
interesting, my girlfriend also similarly, same thing. It's just, it just sounds dumb, but
it's now become the thing is, after a while, you realize everyone says that will never work because you're doing something that hasn't been done before. And if it was so obviously a great idea, it would have been done already.
mm-hmm.
So you are always making some assumption that there is one aspect of this that's been either overlooked or underestimated or an approach that hasn't been tried. There's something that gives every entrepreneur this confidence that it will work. And what happens is it begins to flip. And now when someone tells you that will never work, it becomes this rallying cry. It becomes almost an inspirational thing. I'll prove it. And it requires this unbelievable self-confidence in a way that this thing that everyone tells you is never going to work, well, I'm going to figure out a way to make it work.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny, Zach, these things all come full circle because when you do come up with this great idea and you tell everyone that'll never work, and then they all tell you that'll never work, the reality is, most of the time they're right. It doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the point. Like I said, it's not having the one big idea. It's not the epiphany moment. It's the problem you're trying to solve, and you're remaining flexible to what mechanism you use to try and solve it. And that's how you get past that will never work. Fine, okay, this doesn't work. Well, fuck you. I'm going to try something different.
Yeah,
and I'm gonna get it to work. I am going to get it to work.
yes, and that's
there's a weird listen, you got me on a rant here. There's a interesting dynamic in entrepreneurs, and uh, always before we went on the air here, I was telling you how I try and avoid doing things. I've got to be in the same place at a certain time, but there's certain people I like doing it for because they fall into a certain category, and you're in that fairly rarefied category, which is it requires two different things for an entrepreneur, at least for me to want to work with them. The first one is you have to have that unbelievable self-confidence because, as I told you, everyone's going to tell you that'll never work,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to be able to sit back and go, "Nope, I'm going to make it work." But it's got to be paired with this ability to listen, because when the people tell you that will never work, what you have to do is go, "Why? Why do you think that will never work?" And you would better hear what they're saying. And I'm not saying you have to do it. Um, but you'd better factor it into your thinking so that you're not just bullheadedly going, everyone's wrong and I'm right, but it's taking in so you don't fall in the same hole as someone else has fallen in. It may guide you of how you maneuver around the thing that they think is the fundamental reason it won't work. It's a really interesting dynamic. That will never work concept is a pretty deep and nuanced one.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to call out. It's like a weird combination of humility and confidence that don't really come
Yes,
naturally
that's it.
to a lot of people because yeah, you're right. I mean, like there would have been an easy way, and I'm sure a lot of people do. And I don't want to turn this into patting myself on the back, but there are certainly things that I've heard that will never work. But then from people who are much smarter than me and leading this in crypto, hearing like kind of where the narratives and where things are going led us to launching now one of the most successful at right now. And who knows, things can change. But it's cool to see being at the leaderboard of like Azora Creator Coin that's up there and leading the charge as a community-owned media outlet. So
you,
we'll take the
you've
wins when we
you've
get them.
gotten way further
Yeah.
than most people, than the great majority of people do, and I think it is because of your flexibility.
Well,
It's
thank
like
you.
you have a vision for what you want to accomplish, and I get the sense you're reasonably open to different ways of doing it, and that I think is the fundamental thing. We talked briefly a while ago about how there's this myth of entrepreneurship, and it's a confirmation bias.
Hmm.
I mean, you see these handful of super confident and, pardon me, super arrogant entrepreneurs. But what you don't see is the other 99.5% of the entrepreneurs who are equally, if not more arrogant, who
Yeah.
didn't didn't succeed. And my premise is because they're so arrogant about it.
Yeah, and people
Uh,
don't really want to work with them. And
I'm
also it's like kind of
I'm
buying
the
into it. It's like when things look like they might not work out, that's the other thing too, is like how much is someone willing to support you if it looks like it might be faltering. It's like I'll be the first to say you don't get to the finish line because you did it yourself. It's like at what point did you find someone along the road that might be willing to help you, that might be willing to open a door? And I think the really cool thing about what we've built and having people like you in kind of the network of what we've built is that there are people who have opened doors simply because they're kind of co-owning this with us. And it's like, it's corny as well. I'll use a corny line, but like when I interviewed Pitbull and he was like, yeah, you got to give it away. It's like money doesn't buy you happiness, but if you let someone else kind of along for the ride, maybe it will. And so like that's what's been cool is I think creators do think that way more naturally than maybe other people in quote unquote business. But as you see attention merging with money online, it's not simply like a quid pro quo. What are you willing to pay for this? And then that's it. It's like, no, we're in this together and let's see what happens.
Yeah, it's a. I don't take this the wrong way, but I did not support you necessarily because I was so confident this was going to be a huge success and I'd be wealthy from it. Uh, I did it because I went, this is a really interesting problem, but more importantly, because I want to get the front row seat to watch you take it on.
Yes.
And I think that is the essential of co-ownership. It's
Yes.
like, well, there is some. I mean, I think the reason that so many people in Hollywood, and I use the term geographically broadly, come to work every day is because they love the idea of creating cool things. And what your concept does is allow lots of people to participate in that who would never get the chance otherwise,
Well, I think that's
who
the
would
other
have to
interesting
just,
thing too of like peeling the curtain back, pulling the curtain back and saying, look, if you actually want to be participating in this for a really long time in crypto, it had been like, hey, you can't touch that. You're not allowed to actually say someone co-owns something. And like we discovered the co-op model, went down the rabbit hole, figured it all out, and we're working on that. And just the idea of, for a really long time, it's like people were comfy with just like buying something and speculating, like maybe it goes up, maybe it goes down. And I think we've evolved as a space beyond that now. And so it's been interesting to kind of get into it. But I do want to take the last few minutes here, Mark, to kind of focus a little bit more on looking ahead and the idea of where things go from here, not just for Coinage or Bestish Ever or what we're doing at Trustless, but really for kind of where you see from a broader perspective the future of content going. Because as AI takes off, for me, that's where it really started to click. Because if suddenly, and maybe you could say I'm wrong on this, if suddenly someone can put in a prompt into ChatGPT or something of the like and produce a movie that is really good, like where does this all go is my big question. I'm curious if you've kind of pondered that, if AI gets to be that good, how it might disrupt the content world.
Yeah, not surprisingly, I think about this a lot. And so there's two aspects to it, in my opinion. So one is, of course, it's going to disrupt it tremendously. Um, Everything is going to change. And so for an entrepreneur, I find that actually remarkably exciting. Uh, every established business process, and content is just a business process in some ways, is going to be done differently. And when that kind of disruption happens, it's opportunity for the people who all of a sudden realize all the barriers that established companies, established organizations have is gone. It's level playing field. And in fact, if anything, it's now tilted in favor of the people who are more versatile and more flexible, and are not locked into these rigid arrangements. So Hollywood, my gosh, it is so completely hidebound, if that's how you pronounce that word.
I actually
There's
never heard that. I've never
amazing.
heard that one before.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. There's a whole collection of words that I've read thousands of times, and I never heard
Uh,
them spoken out loud. So I'm always guessing. And funny, it's quick. That was one of the cool things about doing the audio book. Is like I'm reading the book out, reading it into the mic, and the producer is going, "Wait, stop! That's not how you
what
pronounce
did
that."
you say? Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, um, but anyway, I mean, Hollywood is certainly ripe for disruption because of all the structure that's been put in place that's very, very difficult to dismantle, which means they are not going to be able to do that pivoting, twisting, trying things that we said earlier on the call are so critical. So AI is going to change everything. It's an amazing opportunity, whether you're a creator or whether you're in the business of trying to facilitate distribution or whether you're trying to pioneer co-ownership or my gosh, what an opportunity to see everything broken open like this, whether you're using AI to solve the problem or not.
Yeah.
Um, but let's talk for a second about what AI does to content. And I think this is the part that I really think about a bunch. And I've been thinking about it more in the context of writing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I love, not surprisingly from the book, I love writing. I'm this ridiculous geek who will spend 40 minutes on a stupid email that really is not consequential because I love that challenge of how do I capture exactly the right tone and exactly the right content. And I'm doing it for the art of writing.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm the person who will go back and reread an email they sent a week or two ago and go, God, that was good. Boy, that was a great email. And and of course, what's happening now is writing has that craft is becoming disrupted as well. What happens to writing when you could just craft a good prompt and boom, out comes I'm working on a keynote speech and uh, I have the outline pretty well done, and I went to Claude and go, here's what I've got so far, but the point isn't clear. There's not enough of a hero's journey here. What would you suggest? And holy shit, it came back and it gave me a chill that how unbelievably thoughtful it. That's the only word I can come up with for
Yeah.
the recommendations it gave. I went, oh my God, this is terrifying. Okay, so what does this mean for content? Is that if you look at this has happened to thousands of things over the years. Like furniture, for example. Back in 200 years ago, all furniture was handmade. It all bore the mark of its craftsman. Um, and then, of course, with the Industrial Revolution and with automation, all of a sudden you have IKEA and everything, 95% of furniture is identical and pretty shitty, but better, way better than the handmade stuff a long time
And
ago,
cheaper.
and certainly cheaper and faster. Um, but that doesn't mean the market for handmade furniture is going away. That it's just a more rarefied, it's more expensive. Um, and I think content will be the same. I think producing schlocky stuff is going to be a lot cheaper, a lot quicker, a lot faster. Um, Basic content, easy content, formulaic content, it's going to dramatically change. But I believe there's always going to be a space for
Let me ask
super,
that too.
super, superlative stuff.
Yeah,
The,
because I
the
mean,
New
I
Yorker,
think
New Yorker magazine's not going to go away.
well, I think that's the interesting thing of
There's
pairing value and superlative stuff, like how you define it from like a, and maybe this is the key. Maybe this is the key of what happened in Web 2 versus Web 3, like the idea of Facebook and like crafting micro niche content so you can have like little groups on the internet that kind of like find this content and what's going to happen now. And this is kind of my question to you, Mark, in terms of, okay, what does it look like in terms of actually finding the value of that content? And this is more of like the business brain side of things, is that like when you kind of allow someone to say like which one is actually good, this AI slop over here that to your point is actually terrifying how good it is, but then if someone can tell because it's verified on chain or because it's actually like the ability to co-own it is there, like does it start to force us to say what we actually value? And whether it's, I know Netflix has now started to look at attention in terms of like how they think about earnings, is like how much time are people spending on our platform? Is like attention becomes the new asset. But we vote with kind of where we spend our money. Money is attention, money is time. And so it's very interesting to think about how money and attention are merging in this era of the internet and what that means for how we say we value content.
I agree. There's so many interesting questions to be answered that were not answerable before. It is like a Web 2 to Web 3 transition world, and I'll be the first to say I haven't the slightest idea how it's going to shake out. My the things I was laying out for you is more about my optimism
Mm-hmm.
that I'm optimistic. I'm an AI optimist because I think it is going to allow every business process to be rethought and reshaped, and that's an opportunity, and it's so interesting. I think there's always going to that AI does not necessarily mean a slide where people who have creativity and insight and taste become irrelevant. I'm optimistic about that. But probably the most fundamental thing, this is really what applies to what we're talking about here, is I don't waste a lot of time trying to guess what the future is going to look like. I spend most of my time trying to ensure that I put myself in a position that I can take advantage of whichever way it happens to break.
Yeah.
And I think that's the better way to think about it. Yes, you have broad bets, but I genuinely do not think the AI business model has been seen yet.
No, I think that's a
I
really good
think
thing
we're we're
to
prior to April 2000 in the AI world. And April 2000, of course, is when the dot-com market completely collapsed. And when all of a sudden they recognize you need a business model, and you recognize all these things that had there had been this irrational exuberance about the power of the internet, the exact same shit we're seeing right now about AI. But we haven't yet seen our April 2000 moment.
no.
And
Oh,
that
okay.
will shape the world once all of a sudden it begins to become more clear how does this business model work.
Yeah, no, I think that's the interesting thing, and it's encouraging to hear you say that you're an AI optimist because there's certainly an equal amount of people probably on the other side saying like, "Hey, I'm not sure how this is going to go for like journalists or anybody else who works in content, and the idea of them getting scrapped because all this stuff." And to me, Andrew Yang might have been a little bit ahead of his time in terms of talking about AI and the idea of people needing UBI and like the idea of universal basic income and what's going to happen if we're all not working in the content world. But I do think it is encouraging to hear you say, look, taste making is not going away. And that to me is kind of where my thesis is. If you extrapolate all the way down, where it's like one sentence prompt can make a full movie, it's like you still need humans to appreciate the art or to want to own the art or to like, patron the arts. And so like that seems to me impossible to go away if we are going to still have human connections in this world. And I choose to believe more of that than the fears of we're all going to die. But
it's a continuum, and there's certainly a non-zero chance we're all going to die, but that's again, I don't know what's going to happen, but I look at the general range of probability, and those are the ones I'm optimistic about.
That seems fair, and I want to echo that optimism as well. And I think again, as I mentioned off the top of this is always kind of it's eye opening for those who haven't read the book. Again, we'll talk about it a little bit more just to wrap up here, Mark. The idea of what you describe in the founder's journey that will never work, and how much it's meant to me to kind of read it and have you on multiple times now. And again, part of the Coinage network and what we're building here. I can't thank you enough, man. I mean, it's rare to kind of find people who still believe and support in things and have revolutionized media once before, and now can't thank you enough for doing this with us.
The reason it's great coming on with you, Zach, every year or so is that it's totally different each time we come on with things you're working on. So that's what makes it exciting.
Yeah, we are chugging along. We'll see how this all goes in terms of not just Coinage, but now excited to have Best Issue Ever out there floating around as well.
Don't take that comment as a negative. It's a positive. That's
Yes.
the point. You're not
Yes.
locked in. You're going where it goes. You're figuring it out, and I'm proud of you.
We're riding some metas. But Mark, can't thank you enough for coming on, man. Appreciate it as always. We'll wrap there. If you can stick around, I'll mention a couple things privately. But there we go. Mark, thanks so much, man. Appreciate it. And thanks to everybody again for tuning in on this stream and this edition of Coinage. For everything else going on in Web3, you can head to coinage.media to learn more about our project. We'll see you again soon.